And that, to me, is the best example of how theater can facilitate human empathy. We all talk about how, we're not saving the world here. Well, in a way, we are, in that we are creating the type of empathy that is necessary in order to do stuff like end wars. And there's no production of Peter Pan or anything else that is going to stop the war in the Middle East or stop the war in Ukraine. But a little bit more human empathy, like the kind that I was experiencing just as those house lights went down. And the world can become a better place. That's why I'm in this business. Lord knows I'm not in it for the money or the stability.
What? Shocking.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. That was the voice of theater director, professor, and new play development guru Seth Gordon, and it is my absolute delight to have him on as the guest of this episode of the Page and Stage podcast, where we explore the art and craft of writing and performance. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon, and this week we talk about the connection between new play development and audience development, the difficulty of teaching directing, and how the American theater finds itself at a crossroads. But before we get to all that, a brief Page and Stage plug. This podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. You can check out everything I'm up to over at pageandstage.art, including my other podcast, 100 Plays, a storytelling resources page, archives of all my previous podcast episodes, my own books and plays, and my weekly newsletter full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free and get the newsletter directly into your inbox each Friday, as well as every new podcast episode right into your inbox every Monday. Everything is free, but if you find value in all this storytelling content, you can financially support me at pageandstage.art or forward any of the newsletters or podcasts to other story-loving friends, or hire me outright as your personal story coach. So, if you're working on a memoir, play, or speech, I cannot wait to hear your story. Now, let me tell you a bit more about my awesome guest, Seth Gordon. Now, I got to work with Seth a few times back in the early 2000s when we both were cranking out shows in St. Louis. He was one of the most thoughtful, patient, and encouraging voices in the entire St. Louis theater community. And now Seth is over in Oklahoma. He headed west about the same time I headed south to Florida, and he is on the full-time faculty of the Helmerich School of Drama at the University of Oklahoma. Now, previously, he served as Associate Artistic Director at the Repertory Theater of St. Louis and at the Cleveland Playhouse. He also served as Associate Producer at Primary Stages in New York. Here's the new play development guru part. In St. Louis, he created Ignite, a new play festival. At the Cleveland Playhouse, he created Fusion Fest, a multidisciplinary arts festival that also included a new play festival inside it. And over at Primary Stages, he created the New American Writers Group. He has directed plays not just at those three theaters, but also at Stages Repertory in Houston, Theater Squared in Fayetteville, Arkansas, Shakespeare and Company in Massachusetts, Syracuse Stage, the Cleveland Shakespeare Festival, the St. Lou Fringe Festival, Studio Arena Theater in Buffalo, American Stage in St. Petersburg, Florida, and again in New York at the Ensemble Studio Theater, Theater of the New City, and countless other places. He received the 2004 and 2006 Northern Ohio Live Award, the 2014 Houston Theater Award, and numerous nominations by the Houston Theater Awards and the St. Louis Theater Critics Circle Awards for his direction of plays. His new book, coming out this summer, Crossroads in the American Theater, New Leaders in a New Age, will be published by Smith & Krause. Seth also directed the Arabic premiere of Our Town in Cairo, Egypt, and we didn't have time to talk about that, unfortunately, but I know you're going to find him to be incredibly insightful and excited about theater and storytelling. Here we go with my conversation with Seth Gordon. All right, I am here online with the one and only Seth Gordon, and this is a treat. Seth and I had lost track of each other for a while. We knew each other, were colleagues back in St. Louis. Then he went off to Oklahoma. I went off to Florida. I fell off the social media, and when I put Facebook back up to start promoting some of my podcasts and businesses, Seth was one of the first people that popped up, and it was like, oh my God, okay, so there is some benefit to social media. Keep tabs on each other. And Seth is coming to you from Oklahoma. Well, I'm back down here in Sarasota, and Seth, thank you so much for hopping on with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Such a delight. So I always like to start with the storyteller's origin story. So you, like me, we have a lot of overlap here. You know, it's theater heavy, theater background, academia. But what was the thing? You know, every actor has this story about the moment they knew they had to be an actor. When was the moment that Seth Gordon knew he had to work in theater?
Oh, goodness. I have actually a horror story about that, but I should say that.
Perfect.
Yeah. I should really start by acknowledging how lucky I am because I grew up in New York City. And so I just took for granted that the world was a mecca of the arts. I had no idea that most other cities didn't have what New York had until I left. And I had wonderful parents who were artists themselves. They were both musicians and were very educated and who encouraged in me a curious mind. And I felt like if I had majored in accounting in college, I would have been the black sheep of the family. So I feel very, very lucky in that way. And I had grandparents who would take me all over New York at all various wonderful theater experiences. I saw James Earl Jones do a one-man show about Paul Robeson at the Booth Theater on Broadway. We sat in the front row, and that really opened me up to what an actor truly does. And I saw the original cast of A Chorus Line for my 12th birthday. I saw all sorts of things that no kid my age had any business experiencing. I did it all. It was really wonderful. There was a point where my grandparents, I can't remember which birthday it was, maybe my 11th or 12th, they got me a subscription to Circle in the Square, which at the time was one of the premier nonprofit classical theaters off Broadway in New York. And I saw amazing actors, some of whom were movie stars who just decided to go camping for a little while and do a really great play. And so that was my formative experience. But the moment in which there were two moments when I was way too young to understand what I was seeing, in which I started experiencing the idea that theater is magic. And one of them was a puppet show. There was something called Bill Baird's Marionettes, which was very famous at the time. I think they were in the Lower East Side in New York, and my grandparents took me to it. And so it was marionettes, the little puppets who, are you don't see who's manipulating them.
Pinocchio.
Yeah. And so I'm enjoying the puppet show. I'm probably 5 years old or whatever I am exactly. And all of a sudden a human walks on stage to interact with the puppets. And I assumed that this was a giant who was going to kill and devour us all. And I went nuts, and my grandparents had to usher me out of the theater. And the actor who walked out on stage was very kind, and after the performance came up and said to me, exactly what you would assume, see, I'm just a normal guy. And I don't have any memory of being appeased by that, but it did make me start to realize how theater is something that engages the imagination in real visceral ways. The other thing, one of the many, many, again, ridiculously lucky things that I did when I was a kid, I don't remember again how old I was, probably around 6, maybe 7. And it must have been, I now know from looking it up, toward the end of the run of the original production of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway. I went and saw it with my parents and grandparents. I don't think I saw, the original cast of whoever I saw. I have no idea who I saw. But in that original production, as you might imagine, they've gotten kicked out of Anatevka. And so they're on their way. And Tevye has his family, and they're walking out of the town. So as they're walking, they're on some sort of trellis. And so the scenery starts moving away upstage, and they're walking in place as the scenery moves. And I am mesmerized by this. How are they doing that? That can't be real. What are they doing exactly? And that's all I could talk about after the show, which my grandparents thought was really cute. But I was upset about the fact that I couldn't figure out what it was. And that, of course, was, years and years and years later, That's still how I look at a play when I see. So, so those are the two really formative experiences. Um, what uh, what really brought me into the theater is being brought up in a household that uh, appreciated the power that the creative imagination can have.
Yeah. Yeah, that those are great stories. You talk about the power of the imagination. I'll never forget. I was doing touring children's theater (TYA). It was in some school gym, a cafetorium, and it was one of those where you see something, out in the back above the heads of everybody, and you kind of just do one of those, and you point out over their heads, and every single head. They're all seated,
Oh, of course.
crisscross applesauce on the floor, and every single head, well, bam!
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
looking over their shoulder, like, what is he looking at? There's nothing there, but that was a moment for me as a very young actor realizing, oh, it's Spider-Man. So much responsibility. Like I had a moment of, that's really cool. That's really powerful. That could be dangerous. I actually owe these, the responsibility hit me in that moment of just what it is we're actually doing to people in those theatrical moments.
Oh, yes, yes. And it's nothing quite like little kids who truly believe, take for granted that everything they're seeing around them is real. Even if it's magical, it's real. Like me, when I saw that human woke up on stage and just, it didn't even occur to me that something imaginative was going on. I just assumed it was real.
Right. There was another great story in the intro of your upcoming book. Yes, everyone, there will be a plug. Seth has a great book coming out called Crossroads in the American Theater. We'll get to that in a bit, Seth. But in the introduction that you sent me, you told a story about seeing a version of Peter Pan and how this story of Barry and his little brother, the true story of what inspired Barry to write the book, how it touched you and kind of gave you your mission, your personal goal when it came to being a theater artist. And it's all about empathy. And I would love to just let you tell that story here live.
Well, I was seeing there's this wonderful organization that many of your listeners,
viewers, whatever,
if they follow theater closely, they're familiar with an organization called Mabou Minds. Mabou Minds is one of the truly great avant-garde theater companies of all time. And they were doing a production of something they called Peter and Wendy, which is one of the many, many countless adaptations of the Peter Pan story that have been done around. And when I was living in New York, I took the train up to Yale to see this production. So I'm sitting in the theater and I'm leafing through the program and I'm reading the dramaturgy notes, as all programs now have. And there is this story of why Barry wrote Peter Pan. And it seems that when he and his younger brother were little boys, they were playing on the ice, and his brother apparently stepped on some ice that was too thin and fell in and drowned. And now you probably have it in front of you. If you have the introduction in front of you, I don't remember his exact age. It may have been 8, if I have that right.
Yeah, 12, I think.
12.
I think it said
okay,
12.
12.
Yeah.
He was 12 years old, and he died. And Barry spent his life affected by his brother's death, missing his brother. And the image or the notion of a 12-year-old who never grew up captured his imagination in a way. My guess is it was a healing process for him as well, to write about a 12-year-old who won't grow up and who takes children late at night through the open window and has them fly and allows them the experience of never growing up. And that's why at the end of the story, the last thing that happens in the story is that Wendy sees that her children are being taken by Peter Pan. Peter Pan has no memory of her because he won't grow up. And he takes them off, and Wendy is left alone in the bedroom to understand that when you're a grown-up, you lose that capacity. But this notion that of a young boy who will never grow up, and how Barry used this story to heal himself from his sadness, was having a great, profound effect on me as I read that. And then just as I read it, and I had that feeling, the house lights went out and the play began. And it was probably the best example of how dramaturgical notes can really have an effect on you. For all those dramaturgs out there who are writing and
Yeah,
wondering, is
yeah,
anybody actually reading this stuff?
yeah.
Well, I am. And when you read it at just the right moment, it can really affect the emotional effect that it will have on the performance. And that's exactly what happened. And that, to me, is the best example of how theater can facilitate human empathy. We all talk about how, we're not saving the world here. Well, in a way, we are, in that we are creating the type of empathy that is necessary in order to do stuff like end wars. And there's no production of Peter Pan or anything else that is going to stop the war in the Middle East or stop the war in Ukraine. But a little bit more human empathy, like the kind that I was experiencing just as those house lights went down, and the world can become a better place. That's why I'm in
Yeah.
this business. Lord knows I'm not in it for the money or the stability.
What? Shocking, shocking.
Yeah.
You heard it here first.
So that's the story that starts the introduction to the book that I've written.
That's great. So since we're there, Crossroads in the American Theater, coming out sometime this summer. So everybody, I will send a follow-up. I won't have a link for you in the show notes for this episode, but as soon as it drops, I will send a follow-up so you can go check it out for yourself. But talk about where the book came from, Seth. And I know it's a series of interviews. I know that you're talking about this very particular moment in theater where there's been this very large turnover. I think you quoted something like half of the regional theaters in the country have shifted leadership
Less than
in the
half,
last
but more
decade
than a third. Yeah.
more than a third, yeah, like in the last decade.
Yes.
And then, of course, the effect of the pandemic, right as this sea change is happening, the pandemic shuts everyone down
Yes.
for a year, and how that has forced a lot of self-reflection and questioning of best practices and assumed ways of doing things in the theater.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, what inspired you to tackle this book, and what assumptions did you have going in, and what did you learn as you went through it? That's a lot of questions there. I'm just sort of teeing up.
Sure. Well,
talk about the book.
I should start by talk about it never occurred to me I might talk about this book. I should start by saying that it never occurred to me that I would write a book. I'm a theater guy, produce and direct plays, and I certainly don't write about this. So this is partly the transition that I've made in the last 5 or 6 years from being in the theater to being in academia. And at first, there was tremendous hubris on my part in that I thought to myself, it's theater. I know how to do theater. I've been doing that since Kingdom Come. I know, when we met, I was associate artistic director of the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, which is not a minor theater. And I was, I had my hands full directing plays and producing plays and doing all sorts of fun things. I can do this. Theater is theater. And what I didn't necessarily acknowledge is that I was really entering a whole new racket known as academia, which is its own animal.
Yeah.
And so I needed to learn how to tame a whole new animal. And part of that was understanding, this is part of the good part, I must say, that rather than being in what is really a small business, the Repertory Theater of St. Louis is a pretty big theater, but as theaters go, but as businesses go, it has less than 100 employees. That's nothing. The University of Oklahoma, my new employer as of 2019, is the largest employer in my metropolitan area. So really, I have gone from working at a little grocery store to working at General Motors. Part of that is working for an organization, not that the Rep didn't operate this way, and the other theater companies where I would work didn't operate this way, but the University of Oklahoma not only really does want me to excel professionally and experience a constant state of professional renewal, and of course for me, professional renewal and artistic renewal are synonymous, but they actually have the money to make that happen. And so there were all these workshops for free that they keep doing. And one of them was for having a great book proposal. Because, of course, they want the faculty to write books.
Of course.
So let's make everybody really good at book proposals. Let's spend some money on doing that. And they got these experts to come in, and I took a book proposal workshop. And at the end of the book proposal workshop, I had a book proposal. Well, what do I do with this now? So I started sending it around. You did a great job a few minutes ago of describing the basic questions that this book is confronting. They are very, very much of the moment in the professional nonprofit theater. And as such, there was some consternation amongst publishers as I started sending this manuscript around, or the idea of it around, that it would actually no longer be of the moment by the time it was published. And so I learned how to start suggesting to people, maybe this isn't about today. It's more of like I'm writing a book about the Cold War. This is a whole era that I'm writing about, not necessarily a moment. So this new era we're in is one in which, as you were describing, there is a huge shift in leadership in the nonprofit movement. The nonprofit movement, for the most part, it was a post-World War II phenomenon. So that means that late in the 20th century, there was a seismic shift in leadership because all those people started retiring, which means that in the teens, approximately, there was another seismic shift in leadership because all of those people started retiring. And then some of them were not retiring so much as they were retired by the Me Too movement, which was a major reckoning throughout the country, but it was more so in many ways for the nonprofit theater because the nonprofit theater, in its own rather hermetic way, fancied itself as a field that was better than that. That was very liberal facing and really didn't have to deal with stuff like that, which of course couldn't be further from the case.
Yeah.
And that was something we all started finding out as artistic directors started dropping. And when they did, it was a shock to some. And the response of what kept you was just as prevalent, especially among women and people of color. So that was a pretty huge shift that was taking place. Another very, very quiet shift that was taking place was one with regard to subscriptions. Subscriptions, of course, are the bread and butter of anything nonprofit. You become a member. This is loyalty. This is kind of like I always fly United because that's where I have my miles. The corporate world has caught on to the idea that loyalty is currency, and that sometimes people are even willing to pay more or put up with more because they've got the loyalty points, and it allows them to board the plane sooner and get a better seat or whatever it is that it affords them. And that's what subscriptions are. We have our seats. We're in row E. We know the usher who seats us. We've been having these seats since 19 whatever. And so this becomes a part of the experience of going to the theater. At the Rep, as you know, Jason, he has since sadly passed away, but we had the same artistic director for 30 years.
Yeah.
Talk about loyalty and sameness. And so there were people who delighted in walking past Steve Wolf, the gentleman I'm referring to right now, and giving him their 5-second review of what they just saw, and he politely responded to everybody. The customer's always right. And this is how a lot of these theaters function. And the thing nobody was really talking about was the fact that if you looked at a graph, subscriptions were going down steadily from sometime around the early to mid-1980s forward. In some of these theaters, it was precipitous, something I write about a lot in the book. Before I worked at the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, I worked at the Cleveland Playhouse in the same position. I was the associate artistic director there, and I joined the Playhouse after this event took place, but at some point in the early to mid-1980s, the Cleveland Playhouse did two things that it was the effects of which it was still experiencing when I worked there. One being it took its physical plant. It had 2 theaters and a lobby that covered both theaters, and they tripled it in size. And now they have this big, huge, cavernous lobby that when I first walked in, it reminded me, this is what the Kremlin must look like. And they had 4 theaters, and so they did that. And then as many resident theaters at the time did, they discontinued the resident company of actors.
Right, right.
And those two things, nobody really acknowledges this. But those two things, if you look at when they happen and then you look at the graph that shows how many subscribers they have, the plummet in subscribers. And the 5 year or so period in which they went from being a quaint little theater to being this huge cavernous theater, and went from being a theater where people can go and see the same actors, actors they know, actors who are on their school board, actors whose kids know their kids, actors who they see at the grocery store, and now they're gone. Those two things happened within a few years of each other, and at the same time, the subscription plummeted. Could there be a connection
Oh,
between this, not an overt one, but really, in a way, an incidental uh, recession from the community to the community saying, I'm just not as interested as I used to be. The way I used to put it at the time was, we fired the brand.
yeah.
And we didn't
Yes.
replace the brand. I don't know if you go back far enough to remember when Coca-Cola changed its formula,
New Coke. Yeah.
which I can only, I don't, about 100 feet from me is something called the Price School of Business, where, the business people of tomorrow learn their trade. I think they're learning how to tie a tie. I don't know what else they're doing over there. But my guess is they teach that moment. This is what not to do in corporate America. Take
Yeah.
the thing that everybody loves and everybody is buying because they love it so much and change it. I would love to have been a fly on the wall
Yeah.
when they
What was that?
decided to do that. So that's what the Cleveland Playhouse did for all intents and purposes.
Can I, Seth, because this was also, I think, in your intro, do you think that part of this was the non, was it the drive of profit? Was it the nonprofit world trying to emulate commercial Broadway touring theater? Was it kind of an eye off the ball of what they're really serving?
Yeah,
That
yes,
community? I
that's a
mean,
great question. This is all integrated. There was, first of all, a turn toward wanting commercial success that the nonprofit theater was actually founded to address, founded to, in a way, really fight against, rebel against.
yeah.
Whatever degree people know this story, theater in America used to be entirely commercial. There was no real notion that theater was an art form. Showbiz. It was a business. It was entirely a business. And, when John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, he was at the theater, of course, as everybody knows. That was a traveling company. And all theater at the time were traveling companies, like the Players in Hamlet. That's really what theater was. And then there was this organization called the Syndicate, which is really a polite way of saying this mafia. And
I was just going to say syndicate like it's from John Wick.
yes,
sounds,
actually,
sounds very, very imposing and dark.
pretty imposing and dark if you were trying to run a business outside the syndicate. Certainly, it
Yep.
was impossible
Yep.
because the syndicate owned all the theaters.
Mm,
He who owns the property, the real estate, holds all the power.
yep.
That's true in any business in this country.
Yep.
And and then the syndicate was broken by the Schubert brothers. And if you go to New York today, everything is named after the Schubert brothers.
Yeah.
I even mentioned a chorus line was in the Schubert Theater, where Hell's Kitchen is now playing. So that's the Schubert Theater, which is right off Schubert Alley.
Right. Right.
And almost every nonprofit theater gets money from the Schubert organization. And so the Schuberts broke the syndicate and were heroes. And then they, of course, became a syndicate themselves.
To themselves, yeah.
And they, to this day, of course, the Schubert brothers are long gone, but the Schubert organization owns about half of Broadway. The Broadway box, as they call it, is a neighborhood that, for all intents and purposes, exists because the Schuberts built all those theaters, many of which are still standing and have plays in them to this day. So the nonprofit theater was then a response to this new syndicate. We got to break the syndicate. We can't have all of our art form emanating from one city, from New York City, from one little, square mile, where 8 people, all of whom are white men who chomp on cigars, determining every play that's going to be popular in our cultural lexicon. That can't be the right way to do this.
Yeah.
So, like everything else in America, let's expand. Have a theater in Washington, we'll call it Arena Stage. Let's have a theater in Houston, we'll call it the Alley. Let's have a theater in Milwaukee. Let's have a theater in St. Louis. Let's have a theater in all of the major centers, and they can have some sort of loose affiliation. That's what TCG is, for those of you who know what TCG is, Theater Communications Group. LORT. We talk a lot about LORT theaters. LORT is League of Resident Theaters. And so these theaters, they are in league with each other, but they are their own animals. They are their own enterprises. And they were built to be an alternative and, to some degree, a rebellion against everything nonprofit. I'm sorry, everything commercial is what I meant.
Right.
That's what the nonprofit theater was built to be. And so there was a long period of time in which the commercial theater and the nonprofit theater were completely divorced from each other. And if you think of, if you put in your head now the image of a dance at a middle school. So all the boys are...
The boys on one side, the girls on the other of the gym, right.
And they look across each other with disdain and misunderstanding. And that was the commercial theater and the nonprofit theater for years. And then one day, Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. produced a new play called The Great White Hope by Howard Sackler, featuring a relatively unknown actor who I've also already mentioned, James Earl Jones. And Broadway producers come and see it and say, hey, this is a pretty good play. And they produce it on Broadway to tremendous success. James Earl Jones becomes a star. Jane Alexander, who is also in it, becomes a star. Ed Sheeran, who directed it, becomes a Broadway director. Arena Stage gets nothing. And Zelda Chandler, who was considered, kind of like the Martha Washington, if you will, of nonprofit theater, thinks to herself, well, that's never happening again. And that began a process by which these different animals started sniffing at each other and realizing that there was actually a lot to gain by working together. Cut to 2025, and the average audience member would be forgiven for having no understanding of the difference and not caring. Why should they? Between commercial and nonprofit theater, over 10% of all Broadway theaters are now owned and operated by nonprofit organizations. The last time I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, I saw Purpose. Wonderful, wonderful play by Brandon Jacobs Jenkins, which the following day won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a great play on a Broadway theater. My guess is that of the 700 or 800 people who were in that theater at the time, I am probably one of, I will guess, fewer than 10 who knew that I was sitting in a building owned by a nonprofit organization and that this play is a nonprofit enterprise, not a commercial one. Who cares? So that has crept into the work in that whereas prior to the Great White Hope and the understanding that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be this, middle school dance.
Mm-hmm.
It can be, we can dance. We can get together. We can do work together, and it will help us.
But then to your point, to come all the way back around, there's unintended consequences. This comes back to pursuing one thing, the focus comes off the other, and the subscribers' rights, everything costs something, right?
Yes, and part of what this costs now is that audience members are not necessarily telling the difference between one product and the next, because there's much less difference. For example, in Cleveland, the Cleveland Playhouse is the main nonprofit theater in town. When I was there, about a 10-minute drive to the east was Playhouse Square. And not only does that sound alike, but Playhouse Square is where all the Broadway tours would come in.
No.
I can't tell you how many people would hear that I worked at the Cleveland.
Call your box office asking for those tickets. Oh, yeah.
Well, not just that. I would see people, I would introduce myself, and I would work at the Cleveland Playhouse. Oh, we love the Cleveland Playhouse. Wicked was wonderful.
Right.
Well, we didn't actually produce Wicked. What did you do? Well, we do this kind of stuff. But we would do The Sound of Music. So audience members can be forgiven for not being able to tell the difference. And then to start wondering, why am I paying for this when the difference really isn't that great? Jason Cannon was in the company for years. Now he's gone. I used to say to myself, what play will Jason be in next year?
Yeah.
Well, Jason's not around anymore. Jason got fired and he moved somewhere else, take another job at some other theater. So why am I spending money on this ticket? So then, of course, the pandemic happens, and there's no theater for a minimum of a year and a maximum of 2 years before some people started going back. And this is a period of time in which a lot of people didn't even go to work. A lot of people didn't put on pants for 2 years.
Right.
And so what is theater now? Theater is picking up the remote and touching a button on it. What are the advantages? Well, one is this costs nothing. This is like whatever it is, $4.99, $5.99 a month. That would be less than any theater I've ever gone to.
Yeah.
I don't have to comb my hair. If I want to go to the bathroom, I don't have to wait for intermission. I can just press pause.
Yep.
If I'm bored, guess what I can do?
Yeah.
Find something else. Can you imagine sitting in Hamlet and he's barely mused on whether to be or not to be? And you're going, you know what? I'm bored. Hang on a second.
Do King Lear. Free bird.
So I'm not sure that I can blame people for not wanting to bother with this anymore. And for someone who sat in that theater at Yale and experienced that overwhelming sense of empathy that I know for a fact, and studies have been done proving that you experience it a lot more live than you do when you watch it on a screen.
Yeah.
This is a loss, and we need to do something about this.
Yeah. So in your book, in your interview, Seth, did you come to any sort of people should still go buy the book, even though we're giving away all the secrets right now? Were there any sort of conclusions or ideas that came about in your conversations with these various leaders about what nonprofit theater especially can do? Because, I mean, you even call it Crossroads. So that means we can go left or right or down the middle, right? So what would your game plan be?
Yes, theater is at a crossroads because it has to decide now whether it's really going to do this. And I guess the point that I'm making here is that this is not a child of the pandemic. This is not like everything was going great, and then all of a sudden there was this pandemic, and now we're really, in a fix.
Yeah.
This is a quiet evolution. This is a little bit more like global warming than it is like somebody dropping an atomic bomb, in other words.
Right. Yeah. The stoppage didn't cause it. It just exacerbated what was already on course. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly the point here. And that is not anything that any of these artistic directors failed to acknowledge. Everybody understood that this was the case. One of the questions that I asked people was, what is your understanding of how and why the nonprofit theater came to be? And of course, I'm asking this of people who weren't born yet when it happened. They all know who Zelda Chandler is. Of course, they cheated a little because last year was the centennial of her birth. And so a bunch of books came out about her that are great books. But they all know who she was. They all know that among the reasons why it was founded was to decenter the art form, get big decisions out of New York and into the community, have theater that serves the community, not just making a buck for people who put money into some play in New York, get community involvement in the running and the attending of these theaters, make them important in the town square. Every town square should have, a place to buy food, a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, a bank, a theater, a barber. We should be in the town square with everyone else, playing a role, one of the people in the neighborhood, as the song goes. And that was why the nonprofit theater was founded. And that was not anything anyone failed to acknowledge. And it really isn't anymore. And that was not anything anyone failed to acknowledge either. The thing that is that I hope is clear in the book, that some theaters have bounced back from the pandemic a little bit better than others. And that is a strong indication of who was doing a better job of really serving their community as a creative force in their community prior to the pandemic. People who didn't have to kind of race out on the street and lay down in traffic in order to get people to come back, because the people were still sold on the idea of attending live theater prior to. Those organizations are having a better time getting people to come back. And so that's certainly something that one of the big takeaway, I hope, is that if you're going to do this, it should be for the reasons why the movement was founded.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that you really
For the
walk
yeah.
that walk.
Yeah. To connect with the people around you.
Yes.
Theater in St. Louis should be different than theater in Minneapolis, than theater in Houston, than theater in Atlanta.
Yes.
That's a different community. They have different vocabularies, different experiences.
And there were artistic directors who noted that, let's face it, when we program our seasons, we're all looking to New York to see what hot show is coming out of there. Who won the Tony? Who won the Pulitzer? Mm-hmm. Let's program that play. Oh, it's 5 actors in one set. Cool. Yeah. What about that musical? Can we do the musical? Is it small enough so that we can afford to do it? Because people love musicals. And so a lot of theaters, you go from one to the next and they kind of look alike. They're a little bit more Starbucks and a little bit less, a locally owned deli.
Yeah. Yeah. I think getting back to kind of that locally owned, that more specific to the region, specific to the area approach. So let me pivot really hard then. So is that part of the reason you're also drawn so much to new works? Like you've founded like 3 different new play festivals, but do you run into the same problem with those? Like, do those new play festivals, were you able to prioritize local playwrights at all? Or was it still pulling from the wider range? Do those get flattened out too? Or do those allow you to drill down more into that community?
A little bit of both. First of all, I should say that my fascination with new plays, not unlike my book, comes from something that has nothing to do with new play. But at the very beginning of my career, I moved back to New York and came upon the time-honored discovery that New York was not pacing, checking its watch, waiting for me to graduate with my MFA.
Shocking.
So that we can finally get down to real business.
Exactly. Now the art can start. Seth is here.
Exactly. Who'd have thunk that's not what people were doing? So the only people who would work with me and hire me were playwrights in the same boat. So most of the work that I did in the very early parts of my career, the very early chapters of my career, were new plays because those are the people who would work with me. And that's how I became connected to a theater called Primary Stages, which is still around today. And I was at Primary Stages not from its very beginning, but kind of like from its second chapter, and presided over a lot of growth there, partly by finding new plays to do and new playwrights to support. And so when I went out into the wider world and started working at places like the Cleveland Playhouse and Repertory Theater of St. Louis, the advantage that I brought to these organizations was my experience working with new play festivals and really understanding how they operate. To kind of answer the first part of your multifaceted question you asked me a few minutes ago, I used new play development as a tool for audience development. Part of what happens, this phenomenon of new plays for an audience member, is training them to walk into the building not having any idea what they're going to see, but wanting to see it anyway because we're doing it, which is generally speaking the antithesis of what's happening now. Today, everybody's like, well, if we're going to do Shakespeare, we better get Denzel Washington.
Right.
Because otherwise, who's going to come? And that playwright did a big hit, so let's do that playwright's next play. What musical are we going to do? Let's do something by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Everybody's heard of that one. So the opposite of this, of course, is what would happen at the Reps New Play Festival, which I called Ignite, in which I had people sitting there looking at the program, seeing which play are we seeing tonight. So these are people who have no idea what they're going to go see. They've bought the ticket and they have no idea what they're going to go see. So I mentioned, a few minutes ago that the Cleveland Playhouse erred in that it fired its brand. The Rep created a whole new brand, when they created a new play festival. And out of that new play festival came plays that they ultimately produced. And audiences came to it because they felt like, I was there for the birth, I'm coming to the bar mitzvah.
Right, exactly. They get invested. I taught a behind the scenes class for years, and the same people would come back over and over because they want to see first read.
Yes.
They want to meet the designers. They want to understand how auditions work. They want to know the backstory of the actors themselves. Where did you do your training? They are so, and once they do, they would come back to the show. I had people who would come see the show then like 6 or 7 times. To your point, that investment, I fly united no matter what.
I refer
100%.
to it as a backstage tour of the creative process.
Yeah.
Everybody loves to see, these are what the props actually look like, and this is how you make the things go up and down. And this is how we actually did that magic thing. It's actually pretty low tech. So this is how we make a play. And one of the things that intrigued the audience would be, my curtain speech. I would always say at some point during its development, Arthur Miller did a reading of Death of a Salesman. And the audience probably had feedback for him afterwards. So that became how the theater and its audience and therefore its community bought into the idea. And of course, what we're doing here is gaining a wider audience who will then allow the rep to not have to program the way we were describing before.
Right.
So this really, in a way, it's almost the equivalent of what, we're talking about with regard to subscriptions. We're training people to always come to the rep because they'll always be intrigued by what they see. Even if they've never heard of it. They've heard of the rep. And they know that the rep is what they're really buying.
Yeah.
So that's how I think new play development functions best. It serves the playwright in that it takes the playwright through that necessary process. It allows the playwright, I always, would tell playwrights, sit in the back because you're reading the audience just as much as you're watching the play.
Absolutely.
At the end of it, I will either introduce you or not, as you wish. And some people, of course, they want to just, be completely invisible. Some of them, they want to, ladies and gentlemen, Jason Cannon, he's in the back row. And they want to just kind of slightly stand and wave and just sit there and be a fly on the wall. And then some of them would want to get up there with me.
Yeah.
So you never know. But I figured it should be to the playwright's comfort level. And the audience also bought into the fact that these are human beings we're dealing with here.
Yeah.
Who, have egos of their own. But it became a very successful endeavor. All of these became successful endeavors for the theaters, partly because of the way they created work. They became an engine for creating product, but then they also were an engine for creating brand loyalty.
And audience loyalty. Yes. And even also because of the cost associated, probably using more local actors.
Yes.
It's hard to travel someone in for 1 week of work, but, grab that equity dude who lives over on 4th Street. Yeah. He can come do your thing.
We used a lot of equity actors. Also, the Repertory Theater of St. Louis is associated with Webster University.
Yeah.
And so we had undergrads, and they loved being a part of this process. They learned so much, and they met great people. And they would read stage directions, and when it was age appropriate, they would play some of the roles. And so that was always a wonderful learning experience. The theater was like a teaching hospital, in a way.
Like the pit, which was great. So great segue set up, Seth, because you just mentioned again university students, and you mentioned having to, how'd you put it, go from a small business to GM, right? Moving from the rep to Oklahoma University, largest employer in the area. But part of what you're up to now there, shifting into academia, so you teach, you direct, I'm sure you mentor, but you also now are just about to launch a brand new MFA in directing program that you've basically built from the ground up.
Yes.
So again, as you've learned, I love my multiple part questions. Question 1, how do you build an MFA program? And 2, how do you teach directing? I get asked this a lot. Like when people have always wanted me to teach a directing class, I've been like, I would love to, but it's the logistics. So I'm curious. Now in a university setting, you've got, a lot of that stuff is set up for you. But for Seth, for you, what was it like building an MFA program to your specifications? And when you teach directing, like what is your pedagogical approach when it comes to teaching an art form like that?
Well, as far as creating the program goes, the University of Oklahoma had a very robust MFA program for many years. And in fact, we've got a couple of people on our faculty who got their MFA at OU. And then it all went away. I'm not 100% sure what year, but somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 20 years ago, it all just went away. And part of this, it was a combination, I think, of a need to cut. There was a budgetary consideration, and then there was some consternation because there were programs at both the graduate and the undergraduate level that were the same. And as you might imagine, the undergraduate students and their faculty were not happy with the fact that, the bigger kids were getting the chocolate and we were stuck with the vanilla.
Yeah.
And then I think there was a lot of burnout. A lot of people were a little overworked. And so it all went away. It was kind of low-hanging fruit when the university said you need to make a budget cut. And so when I came here, there was a very, very robust BFA program in acting, design, all levels of design, stage management, and dramaturgy. And we have one of a small handful of dramaturgy BFA programs. It's a great program.
Yeah.
So this is a very, it's fun. The kids are great. I love working with the students here. They're young, they're curious, they're talented. But there was no graduate program. And so as we rebuild it, we are doing so in slow, deliberate fashion. Fundamental policies for us is to not duplicate anything that's in the BFA program. So we're not going to do a BFA in we're not going to do an MFA in acting. We're not going to do an MFA in any of the design areas. So the first of these MFAs is directing. That seemed like the best place to start.
Yeah.
And I will be heading that up. And creating it is basically an exercise in figuring out exactly what classes someone needs to take in order to do this, figuring out how to make it look so that it fits the universities and the state specifications, and then being incredibly patient and allowing a Byzantine process of acceptance fall into place. There was an approval process that took about a year and a half. And that was me explaining to a lot of people, some of whom are in my field and most of whom are not, exactly what this is, how it will work, why it's important, and how it will field our professional field with more people who the field needs. Those were the things that were important to the university. And to its credit, the university, first of all, is making sure, just like, you go to the dentist, you kind of take for granted this person knows what they're doing.
Right.
You hear the sound that some of those instruments make. And then they say, open wide. You know what you're doing, right? You took a test. Some board somewhere is approved. Putting that thing in my mouth.
Right.
So we want to, the university is making sure that I know what I'm doing and that we're doing something that is going to further people's careers. I understand that. I appreciate that. I would think less of them if they didn't do it. But my goodness, it took some patience to go through, from, first of all, my own faculty to the college to the provost's office, that's, the university at large, the what's the equivalent, the regents as they're referred, which is the equivalent of like the board of directors of the university, to the state regents. And then finally, and they all had questions. And the questions are really, in a sense, for those of us who are theater professionals, this is not unlike someone, you say, could you please cross up stage? And they say, yes, of course, I can do that. Just let me know which way is upstage. Well, you're kind of supposed to know that before you go into rehearsal. So, you acknowledge these are people who don't know this field, but they sure know what it means to learn and how to do that. They're making sure that people are going to learn something and that they're going to learn something they can use in their later life. So I will be patient and I will answer all these questions. And it worked. It took about 1.5 years to 2 years, but it worked. And so that's the answer to your first question.
Awesome.
After all that, I will say that the answer to your second question is there's no answer to that question. I'm not actually teaching people how to direct. I'm placing people in situations where I'm facilitating. They're not really even teaching themselves how to direct. Hopefully, this is an MFA, not a BFA. A is for people to learn how to do something. An MFA is for people to hone that skill and get their career started. That's really what we're doing here. If you don't know the difference between upstage and downstage, you're probably not going to get into the program.
Right.
All due respect. I have nothing against people who don't know the craft, but this is not for people who don't know the craft at all. This is for people who now need to start doing it a lot so that they can hone the skill, so that they can develop muscle tone, creative muscle tone. That's what this is for. So when you come here, you're going to direct a bunch of plays. You're going to take some classes that are not necessarily even in directing, but are in ancillary fields, ancillary craft, so that you can have a conversation with a set designer, a lighting designer, a sound designer, an intimacy director, a fight director, a dramaturg. You're going to meet all sorts of people who will be able to further your career when you're done. You're going to be put in rehearsal rooms with directors who are at the top of their field as their assistant, or perhaps even as their silent ghost, just to watch. And you're going to direct a bunch of plays.
That sounds great.
So that's how we do it.
That's cool. I found that, the script analysis, the how to make stage pictures, a lot of the nuts and bolts stuff is the more easily transferable stuff. The thing I always tell aspiring directors is, how are your soft skills? How is your emotional intelligence? Can you manage energy in a room? Can you keep your temper? It's a huge one in my book. I'm curious, is that going to be part of the instruction too? Like any classes in just human energy management, or in how to market yourself?
Well, I would say those are two separate things. How to market yourself is certainly something we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I always do, I certainly do this in the beginning directing class that I teach at the undergraduate level, but I will likely do it at the graduate level as well. And that is, on the first day, give them an assignment to go do before we talk about anything.
Mm.
Which is really, in a way, it's the equivalent of, we're here to learn how to swim, and I'm going to teach you the doggy paddle, and then I'm going to teach you the breaststroke, and I'm going to teach you all this. But first, everybody jump in the water.
Right.
Okay, everybody pop up to the surface. Let's see, 12 people jumped in. Do I see 12 people? Cool. All right, everybody out of the water. How was that experience? So the idea here is that the hardest part of directing is not text analysis, which of course is essential. And it's not understanding all the different ancillary fields like set design, which of course is essential. And it's not being capable of looking at a budget and knowing what you're going to be able to do, which of course is essential, and we will learn all those things. But the hardest part is something, and of course now we're on a podcast, so I can't show you what it is, but it's when you stand in a room with people and they go, okay, Jason, what are we doing?
Yeah, man. Yeah.
And it's that look that your listeners right now cannot see me do, but they probably all know.
Yeah.
Of someone who is saying, I am an open book, but you know what? I'm just an open book with blank pages.
Hmm.
So you take the reins. You provide the leadership. I'm going to stand here with my hands on my hips until you take charge. Roll up your sleeves, folks. What are we doing? So everybody needs to have that experience.
Yeah. Man. Seth, I warned you before we started that I had a long hit list, and we got maybe 2/3 of it. But I know we're coming up on time here, so I do want to turn to my wrap, which is always a spotlight. I'm going to give a spotlight here on you, ask you a couple questions, give you a chance to let us know how to get to know you better. But let's start with this. Let's just start with what is your favorite story that you are currently reading or watching? Or like in your case, like a play that you've recently seen that really, really got you?
Well, actually, right at the moment, I'm always reading a book of some kind. I'm reading Lorne Michaels' biography.
I bet that's good.
Yeah, and Lauren, for those of you who don't know, created Saturday Night Live. And to this day, at the age of 80, I hope I'm producing like he is when I'm 80. He is still the producer of Saturday Night Live. So that is week in and week out,
Yeah.
producing something new. Saturday night, they do the show, and on Monday morning, he walks in and they've got nothing, knowing that the following Saturday, they need to wow 20 to 30 million people. Well, that's that. And as somebody who, again, a young, impressionable person, I was a George Carlin fan, and I heard that George Carlin was going to be on some TV show late Saturday night. So my sister and I watched the first ever episode of Saturday Night Live, obviously having no idea
Yeah.
that 50 years later it would still be on the air and still be a cultural touchstone.
Yeah.
So I'm having a lot of fun reading that. But I'm also learning a lot. You know, you asked about this before, the soft skill. And that's really everybody, all the famous comedians who are interviewed because they got their start on Saturday Night Live, and Lauren, to them, you know, he's like George Washington in a way. You know, we wouldn't have a nation if it weren't for the 8 decisions he made.
Right.
And
right.
so one of the things they talk about is how, you know, Lauren isn't particularly funny. Everybody around him is funny. Lauren provides all of the stuff that I can't even describe to you. He makes the room. He makes a room that's possible for people to be funny in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's really what we do. So I'm having a
That's
great time
great.
reading that. And I have a wonderful
Awesome.
friend named Tammy Ryan, who has been writing plays for 30 years. I directed an early play of hers many years ago. Let's see, probably about 28 years ago. I directed her for a play of hers for the first time. And I've directed many others, and she just wrote a new play that I'm having a great time. I had a great time reading that I don't believe has been produced yet. I have no idea if she's comfortable with my saying the name of the play. But I am always reading something. I'm always reading a book, and I'm always reading a play.
Awesome. Great. All right, next question. If you could ask any one person any one question, who would it be and what would you ask?
Oh my goodness. I think I would want to ask Shakespeare what was the first thing he did when he sat down to write. Because I always ask that of playwrights. What were you writing about? What did you sit down to write about? And I ask that of playwrights because I don't want to get that wrong. I figure, you know, whatever they sat down to write about, chances are it's the one thing that's holding the play together as we speak. And I want my production of this play to reflect that. And I can't imagine ever thinking that Shakespeare's plays are about one thing. So there is no one who writes with his breath that I know of. There are many, many extremely dynamic writers, novelists, even more than playwrights.
Yeah.
Of course, in a novel, you can do so much, you can write about so much more. But Shakespeare did it, and I would love to know how.
That's a big one. All right, next question. What is the best advice that you have ever taken?
When I was a graduate student, I directed The Seagull. Yeah, I've always wanted to take another crack at that one because, you know, I'm ever so slightly older and more experienced now than I was when I got my MFA. And I feel a lot more capable of taking on a play of that breadth and sophistication. And so, you know, I was in the middle of it, and I was standing outside the drama office at Carnegie Mellon where I got my MFA. And one of the professors came up to me, "How's it going?" And I can't believe I'm not still standing there now, describing to him all the problems we were having. And he listened very patiently to everything. And then he said the thing that I remind myself at the beginning and end of every process. He said, you know, he was a set design professor. He was not a directing teacher. And he said, whenever I watch directors, it occurs to me that the most important decisions they make are at the very beginning of the process, the first few decisions they make, and at the very end of the process, the last few decisions they make. And so I then, of course, raced over to the theater and made my last few decisions. And I have never forgotten that. I have always taken that with me, like the first few decisions and the last few decisions a director makes. And my guess is a producer as well.
Yeah.
And the first few decisions you make are what guide you through the rest of the process. The last few decisions you make determine whether or not it's finished and determine whether or not the initial creative impulse is actually there.
Oh, that's really good. It's kind of, it reminds me a bit of the 80-20 rule.
Yeah.
You know, that whole idea, like I've noticed this in tech especially, you're going to spend 80% of your time on the first 2 minutes of the play and the last 2 minutes of the play. There's so many cues. It's in those pockets. This is so good, Seth. I know we could keep going. This is such a joy. But let's finish here with tell the listeners / viewers, and people might be reading the transcription. There might be readers. Tell everybody out there partaking how they can learn more about you. Do you have a website? Is there a place they should look for your book? Or that you have shows or projects coming up?
Sure.
Where can they learn more about Seth Gordon?
My bio is on the website for the University of Oklahoma School of Drama. So let me just see what that web address is. ou.edu/finearts/drama. And so my bio is there under people. And then when you go to that website now, right on the first page, it says, earn your MFA in drama directing. And it's, the most recent thing we've done. So that's right there on the cover page of the website. And so my bio is there, and there's a nice picture of me there. And information on the MFA is there. The book is called Crossroads in the American Theater. It's published by a group called Smith and Krause. And so it'll be available on their website. And it'll also, of course, like everything that has ever been published known to humanity, it will also be available on Amazon.
I always link to primary sources, Seth. I'll send them to Smith and Krause.
Right, yeah, please do.
Fantastic. Seth, man, oh man, so good to reconnect.
Well, yeah,
thank you so much for taking the time today. And when the book drops, let me know. And everyone out there, I will send a follow-up link with a direct link to Smith and Krause for Crossroads in the American Theater by the one and only Seth Gordon.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jason.
You've been listening to the Page and Stage podcast. All my thanks to this week's guest and to all of you out there for listening. If you enjoyed or found value in this podcast, I ask that you share it with at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. I use an incredible online app, Riverside.fm, to produce this podcast. If you are interested in producing your own podcast or other audio or video content, I cannot recommend them highly enough. I've left a link for you in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. The show notes are also where you can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects. I use Substack as my primary publishing platform over at pageandstage.art. The Page and Stage podcast is only one part of my story coaching work. You can check out everything I'm up to over at pageandstage.art, including my other podcast, a storytelling resources page, my own books and plays, my one-on-one coaching, as well as my weekly newsletter full of tips, tricks, inspiration, and encouragement for storytellers of all stripes. You can sign up for free over at pageandstage.art. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.